fibers that connect neurons to each other in the brain and help different parts of the brain to talk to each other. We also see chemical changes that affect neurotransmitters and protein production in the brain. Over here, you can see on the right a visual kind of schematic that shows, so this is a cross section of the brain, what we'd call an axial cut. And you can see on the left side, a healthy young brain, and on the right, you can see an atrophic brain where we have narrowing of the gyri. These are the outfoldings, and widening of the sulci. These are the infoldings at the surface of the brain. And we see that the ventricles are enlarged. These are sort of cavities in the middle of the brain that produce the cerebrospinal fluid that flows throughout the brain. Those become enlarged with this loss of volume. So not surprisingly, with these structural changes in the brain, we see changes in cognition as well. Should I be accepting those or admitting those people so that goes away?
Oh, not sure why that's showing.
I think I can.
I'm admitting people, so no.
Oops. Okay. Well, I won't fiddle with that then. Some of the cognitive changes that we see are changes in what we call working memory. So this is your ability to hold on to information in the short term and perform computations and calculations to manipulate that information. We see changes in attention and inhibitory control. So this is our ability to focus on the things that are important, to tune out the things that are not important and not react to those things. And then we see a slowing of overall processing speed. So this is the speed with which we undertake those mental calculations. When we look in the brain to see what kinds of activity we can see, we also see changes. Again, not surprisingly. So changes in brain structure, changes in behavior, we see changes in brain activity as well. So how do we study this? We use what's called functional MRI as one tool. fMRI is basically a means to see what parts of the brain are active during certain kinds of tasks. So many of you have had an MRI scan, and this is typically a structural scan that gives us really high resolution pictures of the brain structures. In a functional scan, we ask the person in the MRI scanner to do some kind of task, and we can see what parts of the brain are active by looking at a change basically in the ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated hemoglobin, which reflects work being done in some region of the brain. And you'll see in studies that report fMRI data, these basically blobs on the brain. And this is just a statistical map of brain regions that are active. So in studies where we've looked at older adults versus younger adults performing tasks in the MRI scanner, we see certain patterns emerge. So on the one hand, we see less activity in older adults relative to younger adults in task-related regions. So in this panel at right, you can see across these different kinds of memory tasks, in the right hemisphere, less activation than in the younger adults. We also see an increase in activity in other parts of the brain. So whereas the activation in the in the younger adults is on one side of the brain or unilateral, in the older adults, we're seeing activation on both sides of the brain. So it seems that there may be a reduction in activity in areas dedicated to a specific task, like remembering words or faces, but then an increase in activity in other parts of the brain that may be adaptive or compensatory in some way. That's actually an unanswered question. So we don't entirely know how to interpret these changes in brain activation. Maybe neural processes are becoming less specialized, and you're just using more parts of your brain as you age to perform at the same level that you used to when your brain was younger. Maybe the brain is becoming less asymmetric, and you're more likely to use both sides of your brain instead of just one side to perform a certain task. And this is the really critical question. Are those increases in activation outside of those specific task-related regions actually compensatory or helpful? Do they actually help us to perform better on certain cognitive tasks? And that's something we haven't entirely sorted out yet, but there's a lot of research going on in this area. So let's move on to the important part of today's talk, and that's language. So I'm a speech language pathologist by training and a language neuroscientist. And I'm very interested in language in the aging brain. And this has been a very active area of research over the last several decades. And I'll spend all of one slide talking about the complexity of all of the component neural processes that allow us to comprehend and produce spoken language. So this is a largely left hemisphere supported process, so mostly on the left side of the brain in most people. And you see in this cognitive model, actually it's a neural model where we can see mappings of certain functions onto specific regions in the left hemisphere, that there's quite a lot of complexity here. And if you think about it, when you comprehend language, there are lots of things going on. So at the most basic level, we have to process the incoming auditory stimuli and map sounds onto words that then allow us to access word meanings. And then we have to decode words in a sentence to access even higher level meanings. And then on the production side, right, we have an idea, we have a concept, we have to find the word to express that concept, we have to assemble those words into complex sentences, and then through this really amazing, really finely tuned coordination of the articulators, we can enact the motor commands to produce those sentences that can then be comprehended by others. So really complex processing at the level of the brain. And we've already talked about how there are structural and functional changes in the brain. So do we see changes in language with aging? Well, there's some good news and then there's some mixed news. So on the comprehension side, so this is our ability to understand what others are saying to us. Let's think first about the single word level. So word comprehension, mostly preserved with aging. But we do see that older adults have more difficulty with recognizing words in noisy environments. And that's even above and beyond hearing loss that we often see in older folks. Or when speech is produced really rapidly, older adults have a harder time processing words. And we see changes at the level of the brain, suggesting that in these noisy or difficult listening conditions, we have regions in the front of the brain that are sort of coming online to help us to perform that task in the older brain, right? And so these are regions that are less active in younger people in these difficult listening conditions. And we think these regions are important cognitive control regions. Okay, what about comprehension of sentences? So that's more complex, right? Also, mostly preserved with aging. However, we do see some differences in that older adults take longer to process certain kinds of sentences. So when we think about sentence construction, there are really simple sentences like the boy kissed the happy girl. And then we can express the same concept with a complex sentence. The girl who was happy was kissed by the boy. Those sentences mean the same thing. The latter sentence requires a lot of grammatical decoding to access the same concept. Older adults do just fine decoding complex sentences, but it takes them longer. And when we look in the brain, in the fMRI scanner, when we ask older and younger adults to listen to simpler sentences and complex sentences, we see that older adults have less activation in this left frontal region that is really important for grammar, but they have more activation in these bilateral frontal regions that again seem to be important for cognitive control. So it may be the case that the brain is adapting and performing these more difficult linguistic tasks by recruiting these additional brain regions. And what we see then in everyday behavior is that older adults are performing pretty well. Now on the production side, so language expression, this is where we see some differences that are a little more significant. So the most common complaint amongst people, healthy aging individuals, is I just can't remember the names of things. We all experience this sometimes. So you're trying to remember the name of that actress who's in The Wizard of Oz, and you can picture her braids and you can picture her patent leather shoes, and her name is on the tip of your tongue, right? So this is called tip of the tongue phenomenon, and it increases with age. This probably doesn't surprise any of you who've experienced this. And so here you can see with age, this increase in tip of the tongue phenomenon. So word finding, or this coming up with words when we need them, does in fact decline with age. The sort of better news is that this isn't that it's not the case that we've lost these words or these concepts. We just have a harder time accessing them when we need them in conversation, right? And so studies have actually shown us that with aging, your vocabulary actually grows and grows. So this is a cognitive ability that actually gets better and better with age. And our conceptual knowledge, our knowledge about things and people in the world, that actually also continues to grow and grow with age. So keep doing those crossword puzzles. Okay, quick interim summary before we start talking about language impairment. So the aging brain experiences both structural and functional changes, and this manifests as changes in cognitive function. When we look at language specifically, we see that most abilities are largely preserved in healthy aging individuals. And when we look at the imaging studies where this has been investigated, we see that there may be changes in underlying neural activation that promote sort of maintenance of language skills despite brain aging. So I'm a speech language pathologist by training, and I see people who are concerned about their language all the time. So when do I become concerned that somebody's complaint about not being able to find words or not being able to understand what others are saying really is a red flag and something that we should be concerned about? When is this change not part of healthy aging? So we get worried when the changes are rapid. With healthy aging, these subtle difficulties with language production emerge gradually over time. If we see sudden changes or rapid changes, we get worried. We also get concerned if we see changes under the age of 60 years. We also get worried when cognitive and motoric processes that aren't typically affected by healthy aging are noticeably impaired. So when people have trouble with articulating words and speaking intelligibly, we get worried. When people seem to have lost their word knowledge or their basic vocabulary, we get concerned. And when people have trouble speaking in correct and complete sentences, we get concerned. And ultimately, someone experiencing these kinds of changes may be diagnosed with aphasia. And this is a term that's been in the popular media. Can I help with that? You sure?
Is there a way that you can move the toolbar to the bottom? That's what I don't know.
Or just click that
So
X.
the issue
Push an
is that
X.
I have to get out of my talk and then maybe I can do some of that.
Can you just X, see that?
Yeah, I'm moving that and
bar
then
at the
I'll
top and X
get rid
that.
of that.
There you go.
Great.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, everybody.
Sorry about that.
Technology is our friend, except when it isn't. And now that thing's back.
You're fine.
Oh my word. Ah!
If you click more, you can hide the bar.
Okay, click more, hide the bar. Bear with me, folks. Hide the panel. Hide them. Okay, okay. Maybe that'll help. There we go. Yay! Sorry, everybody. Okay. When we see these kinds of changes in language are more pronounced, occurring more rapidly, or when they start to really affect a person's ability to function in everyday life, they may be diagnosed with aphasia. This is a term that's been in the popular media a lot. There's a famous person who's had an aphasia diagnosis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, what is aphasia? Aphasia is an acquired impairment of language. So what that means is that a person has had normally developing language over the course of their life. And then after some sort of insult or injury to the brain, we see that they start to have trouble with communication. Typically, production and comprehension of language are affected. And aphasia happens in many cases in the absence of more global cognitive changes. So this is really specific to language. Usually, speech language pathologists like me are going to see people with aphasia who've had a stroke. Most cases of aphasia have been caused by a stroke, typically in the left hemisphere. Let's take a listen to a gentleman talking about his experience with aphasia after his stroke. So you could hear this gentleman is struggling to talk about what's difficult for him in terms of communication, struggling to express himself. He's having trouble speaking in sentences. He's having trouble finding and articulating words. You could only imagine just how frustrating this would be in the context of your everyday life. And so again, this usually happens in the context of left hemisphere damage, in this case, left hemisphere stroke. Aphasia caused by stroke, the incidence is about 180,000 new cases per year in the US alone. Prevalence of about 1 million people living with aphasia in the US. And the average age is about 68. Quickly want to talk about what aphasia is not. Aphasia is not a disease. So as I was reading articles about Bruce Willis and his aphasia diagnosis when the news first came out, I saw in a number of places, Bruce Willis has been diagnosed with aphasia. It is a disease where, well, aphasia is not a disease, it's a symptom, like a headache is a symptom, okay? So aphasia can be caused by a stroke, but it also can be caused by other things that affect the brain. So traumatic brain injury or tumor or neurodegenerative disease. Aphasia is not a loss of intellect, and people with aphasia feel very strongly that the world needs to understand this better. So even though you're having trouble expressing yourself or understanding what other people are saying, you haven't lost your intelligence. You haven't lost your memories. So you can still remember what you had for breakfast, even though you might not be able to say the word breakfast taco. You can still remember your wedding 30 years ago. And aphasia is not a loss of personality or sense of humor. People with aphasia still are who they are. They may just have trouble expressing who they are. Okay, now let's switch gears and talk about aphasia that's not caused by a stroke. I'm going to let you listen to an individual describing her experience with sort of gradually becoming aware that something was really wrong with her communication. So she's describing this experience of sort of gradually becoming aware that she's not able to come up with words for everyday things. And it's really getting in the way of her ability to function, right? So people start having more difficulty functioning at work. They have trouble with spoken language, but also with reading and writing. And this becomes concerning enough that ultimately they go to see a neurologist, they get referred to people like me. And what we see in the brains of these individuals is not a stroke, but we see regional atrophic changes that are indicative of a neurodegenerative process. And so here you can see on these MRI scans on the left lateralized changes. So you here can see more black, that's cerebrospinal fluid, that's filled in where gray matter used to be on the left side of the brain. And these blobs in this case don't represent activity, they represent atrophic changes in the brain. And you can see they're much more prominent on the left side. So in this case, we refer to the aphasia as primary progressive aphasia, or PPA. And again, the underlying cause is brain disease. It's a type of dementia. We call it a language-based or language-led dementia. And it's different from other types of dementia because we see that the most prominent and the earliest clinical signs are changes in language. Often individuals with PPA experience their first symptoms before the age of 65. And devastatingly, this disorder is going to ultimately progress to mutism. So people will become totally unable to communicate, totally unable to comprehend when other people are trying to communicate with them. They also develop other behavioral and motoric cognitive changes as the disease sort of advances in the brain, and ultimately people will pass away. And PPA, primary progressive aphasia, is one type of frontotemporal dementia, or FTD, which again, you've seen a lot in the media of late, lots of discussion about what FTD is. So Bruce Willis's family came out, I don't know, a couple of months ago and said that he had been diagnosed with aphasia. We didn't understand or know, because they didn't at that time choose to share with us sort of what the underlying basis for the aphasia was. And then most recently, they've come out through the AFTD, the Association for Frontotemporal Dementia, and made it known that his diagnosis is actually FTD. We've learned a lot about PPA. When I did my dissertation work a couple of decades ago, we didn't have a very sophisticated nomenclature or understanding of how these behavioral clinical presentations correlated with different underlying changes in the brain. At this point, we have pretty good consensus that there's some different types of PPA with different language features. So a non-fluent type where people have trouble with grammar, have trouble with articulating words. A semantic type where people have a loss of word meanings. So they have trouble with coming up with the names of things, but also with comprehending words and even with recognizing objects. And these two types, the non-fluent and semantic types, are caused by frontotemporal lobar degeneration. The logopenic type, where people have word finding difficulties and difficulty with processing speech sounds. This is actually an atypical manifestation of Alzheimer's disease, where language networks are affected first and foremost. And importantly, these different clinical types correspond to different patterns of change in the brain and to different diseases. So speech pathologists can characterize an individual's speech language deficits and have some insight into what the likely disease is that's causing those changes. Now, from a neuroscience standpoint, primary progressive aphasia is fascinating because it's one window into the neural substrates of language. So we can look at correlations between these pathological changes in the brain and language behaviors that are of interest to us, like grammar, like motor speech or articulation, like phonological encoding. This is putting the sounds together into words to be able to say them. But as a clinician, while this is all fascinating, the thing that was most devastating and striking to me when I first started interacting with these people in a research context was that they weren't getting any help. They were being told by neurologists that today was their best day, that everything was going to be downhill from there, that there was no point in getting any kind of treatment because they were just going to get worse anyway. Could you imagine what it feels like to be told that? So the question that I began to ponder is whether this is entirely a story of loss or whether there might be another side to this story. And so I'd like to take a moment, a little detour, to tell you a story about an individual. And her story is a fascinating one that's actually been reported in a research paper in the journal Brain and also in a podcast. So it wouldn't be a talk in the 2020s without talking about a podcast. So this is an episode of Radiolab that's actually kind of old, but I really encourage you to listen to it. It's fascinating. It's called Unraveling Bolero, and you'll see why in just a moment. So the paper and the podcast tell the story of this individual whose initials are AA. She was a professor in biology, and she worked in academia till she was about 46 years of age, at which point she left her job to take care of her adult son who'd been in a motor vehicle accident. And around this time, she started to paint. She never went back to her academic job. Her artistic interests evolved. She started to paint more and more. She started to paint obsessively. And eventually, she started to paint really unusual and interesting things. She started to represent auditory phenomena in a visual form. And in particular, she became really fascinated by the composer Maurice Ravel, and she started to paint a visual representation of his probably most famous piece, Bolero. Now, the sad side of the story is that about 7 years later, she developed symptoms of primary progressive aphasia, and that's when she came to the attention of researchers. A few years later, she had a PPA diagnosis, and then ultimately she passed away before the age of 70. So she went to see some of my colleagues actually at UCSF at the age of 64 to get a language evaluation to try to figure out this diagnosis. And what I'm going to play for you is a clip of her describing a picture. It's sort of a standard picture that we use. I realize you can't see it very well, but it's a picture of some people having a picnic. So she's able to name single items in the picture pretty well, although she struggles a little bit with some words. She's not able to put any of those words into sentences. changes. And you get the sense that there's effort, there's frustration with what should be a pretty simple task and would be for most of us. And remember, this is a highly educated person. Can you imagine how frustrating that must be? So at the same time that she was visiting UCSF for this research visit, the researchers were also taking a closer look at her art. And what you see here is her painting, Unraveling Bolero. At the same time, I'm going to ask you to listen to the piece Bolero. You may have heard it before. It's a really repetitive piece of music, almost compulsive, with the same elements repeated over and over, and they go from being really quiet in the beginning to building to this really impressive crescendo at the end. And so now I'll call your attention to some of the visual elements in her painting. So the beginning of the song is represented over here, and each of these vertical elements represents a bar in the piece of music. And you can see that the bars are short over here. Here at the end of the piece, they're very tall because height of the bar represents loudness. So that's one aspect. And then you can see other aspects of the music that are represented by different visual elements. So the bass line is represented by the contour of the transverse line dividing the figure. Instrumentation is represented by different colors, as is pitch, etc., etc. So just amazing, right? Really, really impressive and very unusual. Does everybody recognize that? Maybe. So at the same time that AA was having her language evaluation done, they also did brain imaging. And this is where it gets incredibly interesting. So not surprisingly, they found that these regions in blue that you see here and here in the left frontal lobe showed loss of brain volume. And this is what we see in PPA, that there are regional atrophic changes in language areas. And this is an area that's important for volitional production of fluent speech, right? So loss of volume here. At the same time, they saw an increase in brain volume in this more posterior area in the right hemisphere. So her brain had actually become more plump in this right hemisphere region that's implicated in perceptual imagery, transmodal creativity, integration of different sensory information. And when they did functional imaging, so this isn't an fMRI scan, but a SPECT scan, they found that that same region in the right hemisphere was actually showing increased activation relative to healthy controls. So what we know about how these regions interact with each other is that these frontal regions in a healthy brain serve to sort of dampen down or suppress these more posterior regions. So what the researchers think is going on is that as these frontal lobe regions are gradually going offline with increasing brain pathology, these more posterior regions involved in creativity are actually being released to flourish. And perhaps this corresponds to her newfound interest in and aptitude for painting. In fact, we see instances of emergent visual creativity and artistic ability in individuals with different types of dementia. I have a shelf in my office, if you ever come to visit me, I'll show you, that has things that patients have made for me. So I have painted birdhouses, painted rocks, photography, handmade jewelry, embroidery. And I don't think this is just a coincidence. I don't think that people with dementia are just bored. So why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you this because I think the story of neurodegeneration isn't just one of loss, but that it's one of sort of dynamic rewiring of the brain, and that with loss of function, we can also see emergence of or harnessing of other functions. And so as speech pathologists, the question that we're asking in my lab is whether we can sort of harness that to retrain communication in people with progressive aphasia. Unfortunately, there's been a lot less research in speech-language treatment for progressive aphasia compared to aphasia caused by stroke. And I think this is largely because of that clinical nihilism, right? Where even speech pathologists, but also neurologists, so referring clinicians, have had this attitude that, well, there's nothing to be done. Or maybe we can help them to get better, but they're not going to stay better. They're just going to get worse. So what's the point? So we've posed the question, Is it possible or even worthwhile to try to train a degenerating brain? And I'll give you a spoiler, we do think it's possible and worthwhile. But to set the tone, I'd like for you to think for a moment about what it feels like. Think again, to gradually lose the ability to communicate and to be told that there is nothing you can do to slow or alter this progression. So we've been investigating this question about treatment for speech and language in progressive aphasia through several different clinical trials. These are based here at UT Austin, but we have lots of collaborators all over the country and world. And so I, with my colleague Stephanie Grasso, who's in the room, have been working with both monolingual and bilingual individuals to investigate the benefits of treatment, not only in the short term, but in the long term for people with PPA. So can they get better and can they stay better? I'm going to talk very briefly about the treatments themselves. So we have two different flavors of treatment depending on the type of PPA that a person presents to us with. So for the patients whose primary difficulty is with finding words in conversation, these people tell us, I know what I want to say, but I just can't say it. And they almost always say it just like that, right? And it's incredibly frustrating. And ultimately, what starts out as something subtle becomes debilitating, and they can't find any words. So the approach that we use is not just simple retraining of vocabulary, although that's a part of it. But we've taken some knowledge that's been gleaned in the context of stroke-induced aphasia, where we kind of know what helps people to retrieve words. So when you can't find a word, and this goes for all of us as well, it's not that you've totally lost the word or concept in most cases. And what happens if you try to retrieve whatever you still know about that word? So if you think about these things, if I try to describe them, well, you know, they're the things that I wear on my face. They have lenses. They help me to see. I lose them all the time. So even though I might not be able to come up with this word, I can still describe the thing. And I can say it starts with G or the sound G. So in stroke patients, we've observed that if we ask people to come up with that residual knowledge and just talk about the thing, it often helps them to retrieve the word. But even if they don't retrieve the word, it's still communicatively useful. Because if I just gave you that description, you'd still know what I was talking about. So it's really a strategy for when you're in conversation and you can't retrieve a word, what can you do to try to help yourself? So these are our trial outcomes to date. This is about 65 patients so far, and we're in the final stages of this particular trial. You can see their performance here at pre-treatment. They're working on words that are important to them. Some of those words we train, some of those words we don't train. And what you can see in green is that the words that we train get a lot better with treatment. And then when we follow the person over the year post-treatment, we do see a gradual decline after they stop therapy. And that's not entirely surprising at all. But you'll notice that where they are 12 months post-treatment is still better than where they were when they started with us. And these are people with neurodegenerative disease. So yes, they can get better. And yes, they can stay better. And they even get better, although to a lesser degree, on words that they haven't trained with us. So that's what you see in red here. And the little asterisks indicate that they're better than baseline all the way up to 12 months post-treatment, even though they haven't trained on these items. So we do brain imaging in these individuals at baseline or before treatment to try to understand what brain structures and connections are helping to facilitate response to treatment. And what we're seeing is that relatively anatomically spared brain regions, so language regions that are less affected by disease, are supporting recovery of function. And this is important because it helps us to think about, well, if we're going to engage in brain stimulation or neuromodulation, which regions might we target, right, to help promote the therapeutic benefit even more. Okay, the other type of treatment, and this is for patients who have trouble not as much with word finding, but with articulating words and speaking in sentences. So think AA, the patient you saw a video of. These individuals complain that they just can't get the little words and they just can't initiate or participate in conversation. So we use an intervention approach that again, we've adapted from stroke-induced aphasia. We develop scripts with these people about topics that they want to be able to talk about. We can make those scripts easy or hard. They're tailored to the individual. And the person practices with an audio-visual model. That's what you see playing there. Basically rehearsing the script over and over and over. And they become more fluent by doing that. But we're also working on conversation. So they meet with the clinician and they engage in conversation about these topics, right? So it's not just memorizing a script, it's working on conversation. And what we see in these folks, again, so here's baseline or pre-treatment. This is their accuracy at producing those scripts. They get better, significantly better at post-treatment, and they're still better than baseline by a pretty significant degree at 12 months post-treatment. Interesting noise. And when we look at pre-treatment imaging in these individuals, and I don't have time to go into much detail about this, but again, we're finding that spared brain regions, and in particular this posterior temporal region and its connections to other language regions, are facilitating or supporting this improved language function. So again, as we think about brain stimulation, where you're actually applying an electric current to the brain, this is kind of the next big thing. In rehabilitation and aphasia, this research is helping us to understand where we might target that neuromodulation. So quantitative changes, right? We've seen improvement. People get better, they stay better. That's really exciting. But we also see that in addition to these improved language skills, people are telling us that they feel better about communication. They're more comfortable, they're more confident. And some people show an overall improvement of mood and psychosocial functioning, suggesting that speech and language treatment can improve quality of life for people with these disorders. And I'm happy to say that at this point, there are over 100 studies, many of them single cases or small groups, so it's still a modest literature, but the vast majority of these studies show that treatment is beneficial for people with PPA. The problem is these people still aren't getting referred to us. So I would say most patients who get referred to our research lab for our clinical trials have not been referred to a speech language pathologist before. So people are still not getting help, even though there is help to be had. So it's our assertion, and we're hoping to get the attention of the neurology community, of neuropsychologists, of research funders, insurance companies, that speech language treatment in PPA should be the standard of care and not the exception. Okay, I'm going to summarize really quickly, and then hopefully we have some time for some discussion. So I've shown you that there are changes in brain structure and function with aging, but language seems to be kind of a special case in that it's largely preserved in healthy aging, despite the fact that we do see these structural changes. In some instances, though, we see an acquired language impairment that's a manifestation of brain pathology, and we refer to this as aphasia. Aphasia can be caused by stroke, but can also be a prominent feature of neurodegenerative disease. And this is an incredibly debilitating disorder. However, hopefully I've shown you that neurodegenerative disorders cause dynamic rewiring, and that it's not only a story of loss of function, but we may see new functions emerging as well. And lastly, targeted treatment can help to improve speech and language for people with aphasia with lasting benefits, both in terms of communication and overall quality of life. I'd like to acknowledge all of the many people who contribute to this research, and especially our research participants who give their time and work so hard with us to help us to learn together. Some resources here, so I encourage you, if you have questions about aphasia or if you know someone with aphasia, certainly reach out to us. My website is on this slide up in the top right. You can reach me, you can reach Dr. Grasso, but you can also go to these websites. The National Aphasia Association and the AFTD are both excellent advocacy groups, and they have lots of resources linked through their websites. And then lastly, a plug for the Talc Graduate Student Council, who's having a get-together soon. So if you're a graduate student and you're interested in the Talc Graduate Student Council, please come to this event. With that, I think we have some time for questions.
And I'm going to have another certificate made up because she has now won the Texas Aging and Longevity Center improvisation of technical difficulties. Thank you, Maya. That was really fantastic. Let's particularly the tradition from HTFS and Center on Aging and Population Sciences that we asked some graduate students to start. So if we could start with a question from the graduate students. Yes.
So thank you for your talk. I really liked it. So my question is, since PPA is the feature of neurodegenerative disease, so does that mean PPA it is causing the death? And is it possible for a person with PPA to live a long age?
So asking sort of what is the mortality life trajectory once you're diagnosed with PPA?
Right. And so the first part of the question is PPA causing people to pass away? So the underlying brain disease, and this could be frontotemporal lobar degeneration, it could be Alzheimer's disease. That's what that brain pathology is what's going to ultimately cause people to pass away. And the aphasia, again, is a symptom of that. And in PPA, the aphasia is the predominant symptom, right? As compared to other types of dementia where we may see changes in memory or other aspects of cognition first. Now, in terms of survival, it varies depending on the disease. But we may see that in some individuals, survival is only 5 to 7 years. And then in people with underlying Alzheimer's pathology, where there's a great deal of heterogeneity, people can live as long as 20 years. So it's pretty variable and really depends on which disease is actually affecting their brain. Yeah, great question. I think we have some online as well, so we can.
Sean, do we have some questions that we would like to ask? Go ahead. And
yeah, let me get up to the first one here. It's from Cass Walters. And have you looked at language comprehension in neurodivergent brains that have issues with fast speech or loud backgrounds?
that have what? I'm sorry.
Fast speech or loud backgrounds?
So I have not looked at language comprehension in people with neurodivergent backgrounds, but I know there's a rich literature on that. And so certainly acquired aphasia is not the only context where we see changes in comprehension that relate to altered sort of brain structure and function. Not my area of expertise, but definitely an area of interest.
Yeah.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I wonder, I don't know if I missed information on the treatment, how often the sessions were and for how long, and if you see that maybe the future is a long-term treatment. It seems like the post-treatment is like a huge improvement from before.
Right. So great questions about dosage and duration of treatment. I didn't go into any of those details because that's a whole other talk, but really great questions. So we try to design our interventions. Are you kidding me? Sorry, people at home, there's a poltergeist in this room controlling the screen. What was I saying?
The treatment dosage.
Oh, we try to design our interventions so that they're consistent with what practicing clinicians in the community could do and what people could get reimbursed for by third-party reimbursers. So people are being seen typically 2 or 3 times a week for about an hour, which is kind of standard. And the total duration is anywhere from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, depending on the treatment and depending on how quickly the individual progresses through the intervention. I think the future of this, and I think this is maybe what you were getting at in terms of the big jump post-treatment, but then what, is going to be phased treatment, where there's not just a single dose, because that doesn't make sense when we have an underlying sort of substrate of decline. We need to reassess and retreat. But at the same time, we want people to live their lives, right? So this is sort of a balance. But I do think we need to kind of shift the current models for care and reimbursement. The stroke-based model doesn't work in these patients where we have sort of a single dose and then people graduate from treatment and they're kind of done. Doesn't make sense here. Yeah. Questions?
Go ahead, Mark.
I thought that was a great talk.
Thank you.
And one of the things that stood out was the importance of behavioral intervention. And I was just wondering, there's a whole other community out there in dementia research, which is more on the medicalization and drug treatment of different kinds of symptoms that come out like this. I was curious whether in your world you deal with this other kind of community out there too, to have a lot more legitimacy, let's say, in treatment circles. So I'm just curious. I know nothing about.
You mean pharmacological treatments? Yes. So we go to the same meetings, believe it or not. But we didn't used to. So I didn't get invited to those meetings. But I think that's a sign that there's been a shift. You're absolutely right. There's this legitimacy to drug trials. And I've always sort of had this, inward chuckle when those people get up and present their treatment effect sizes. And then we get up and present our treatment effect sizes. And it's kind of like, why aren't you paying attention to us? And I think part of the issue is that we're not doing randomized controlled clinical trials because it doesn't always make sense to do an RCT. It doesn't always make sense to apply the medical model to every kind of treatment and every kind of disorder. I do think there's a place for RCTs, but it's not the case that there's just not any evidence until you do an RCT, which drives me a little crazy. But I think we're getting some attention and getting some legitimacy. But we've got a ways to go. And there's a real world problem that comes from this. And that is we're not getting the referrals. People are getting the prescription for the drug that may or may not do anything for them, but they're not getting the prescription for speech therapy. Yeah. Thanks for asking the question so I could get on my soapbox.
Did I follow it right? That the words that you're taking the same person and you rehabilitate some words and some you don't, so that it's almost a control within the person.
Well, that's the thing. We try to do really rigorous experiments, but our controls look different. You're absolutely right. So we have within participant controls, and we do have historical untreated controls from observational studies as well. But the issue of control is pretty different. When you've got someone who's going to get worse and you're seeing them get better, yes, we still need experimental controls, but the interpretation is should be pretty straightforward.
We have time for one more.
Well, there are several questions online, so I'll
Okay.
just send you those later. if
Sure,
that's
I'd be
okay.
happy to follow up with people later if they have questions. They can email me.
Okay. But here's one from Kadir Qureshi. Are people with aphasia able to write or type fluently?
Ooh, great question. So we get particularly family members of people with aphasia who say, well, he can't talk, so why don't you just teach him sign language, or why don't you just have him write or type? And what we see when we look at people with aphasia is that core language domains are affected, and both spoken language and written language tap into those core language domains. So in the majority of cases, if someone has an impairment to spoken language, they also have some degree of impairment to written language, both reading and writing.
I think that we do have a reception just over there so that people can continue to engage with Dr. Henry. And we really do have to thank you so much for just phenomenal talk and so much information for all of us.
Well,
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody at home, or wherever you are. And I do apologize for the technical issues. It seems that people couldn't hear me in the beginning, and I wasn't.
You were fine.
I think we sorted it out, but I think people.
Thank you, and thank you also. I mean, I do want to say that this is the last time we gave this award was 3 years ago. So even though it's 2023, we really think of Maya as the award winner over 3 years. So.
Thanks,
Thanks
Karen.
again.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.